3 years ago, Daniel Carter thought he had found the perfect place to start over. After losing his wife, Emily, to a long battle with cancer, Daniel retired early from his successful career as a civil rights attorney to focus on raising his blind teenage son, Lucas. They sold their home in the city and used every penny to move to Oakwood Heights, a picturesque suburban community that boasted itself as America's most family-friendly neighborhood. The brochures promised tree-lined streets, friendly neighbors, and a safe environment for families. For Daniel and Lucas, it seemed like the fresh start they desperately needed. Lucas, a bright and determined 16-year-old, quickly adapted to his new surroundings. With his white cane, he mapped every corner of the neighborhood, memorizing the cracks in the sidewalks, the placement of garden fences, and the sound of wind chimes that hung from Mrs. Nguyen's porch. The wind chimes, in particular, became a crucial navigation tool for Lucas, their gentle melodies guiding him around sharp corners and steep driveways. The community embraced Lucas. He began teaching piano lessons at the local community center, offering free classes to children whose families couldn't afford private instruction. The neighbors became like family. Mrs. Nguyen, a retired music teacher, helped coordinate Lucas's music programs. Mr. Harris, a Vietnam veteran, installed safety features throughout the neighborhood, and retired police captain James O'Connor ensured Lucas's safe passage during his daily walks. For a while, Oakwood Heights felt like paradise. But paradise, as Daniel would soon learn, is fragile. The first signs of trouble came when Vista Properties, a real estate investment firm, purchased 6 houses in Oakwood Heights and installed Margaret Blackwell as the new president of the Homeowners Association, HOA. Margaret was a sharp, calculating woman with a cold smile and a penchant for control. She quickly gained influence over the HOA board, pushing through new regulations that targeted what she called nuisance behaviors. At first, the changes seemed minor. Mrs. Nguyen's wind chimes were deemed too noisy and had to be removed. The textured sidewalk markers that Mr. Harris installed for visually impaired residents mysteriously disappeared overnight. Then came the anonymous letters, slipped under doors in the dead of night. "Blind people belong in institutions," one read. "Your kind reduces property values," said another. The threats were clear. They wanted Lucas and Daniel out. Daniel, with his legal background, fought back. He filed complaints, documented every incident, and rallied the neighbors to stand against Margaret's growing tyranny. But Margaret was always one step ahead. She had a playbook, a methodical strategy to drive out anyone who didn't fit her vision of a premium community. The tension reached a boiling point when Lucas's story was featured in the local newspaper. The article, titled "Blind Teens App Helps Disabled Navigate HOA Communities," highlighted Lucas's innovative navigation app, which he had developed with other visually impaired teens. The app mapped safe routes through suburban neighborhoods and documented instances of discrimination. It was a triumph, a testament to Lucas's resilience and creativity. But Margaret saw it as a threat. 2 hours after the article went live, Daniel's security system alerted him to unusual activity. Margaret, along with 2 other HOA board members, was following Lucas as he walked to the community center. They had positioned themselves strategically, their phones and cameras ready to document whatever confrontation they had planned. Daniel watched in real time as Margaret approached Lucas. "You don't belong in premium communities," she sneered, her voice dripping with contempt. "We've had enough of your special accommodations and your constant complaints." Lucas remained calm, his voice steady. "Ma'am, I have every legal right to be here. Please stop harassing me, or I'll be forced to file another complaint." Margaret laughed, a cold, calculated sound that sent chills down Daniel's spine. "Complaints? Let me give you something to complain about." The security footage captured it all. Margaret pulling a canister of pepper spray from her bag and spraying it directly into Lucas's face. Lucas collapsed on the sidewalk, choking and terrified, while Margaret and her accomplices continued filming, narrating the scene as if they were the victims. The attack on Lucas sparked outrage in Oakwood Heights. The neighbors, who had once been divided by Margaret's manipulative tactics, now united in their anger. Retired police captain James O'Connor stepped forward, presenting the security footage to the arriving officers. "This was a premeditated assault on a disabled minor," he declared. "And we have it all on video." As the police gathered evidence, Margaret made a crucial mistake. In her rush to flee the growing crowd, She dropped her phone. What they found on it would blow the case wide open. Hidden in a folder labeled Community Standards Enforcement were hundreds of emails between Vista Properties executives and HOA board members across the country. The emails revealed a chilling strategy. Identify communities with significant disabled, elderly, or minority populations. Install cooperative board members. Implement increasingly restrictive standards. And wait for property values to drop. Once the targeted residents were forced out, Vista Properties would buy their homes at a fraction of their value. The scheme was breathtaking in its scope and brutality. Vista Properties had already forced out 12 families in Oakwood Heights alone, including a deaf couple who couldn't respond to HOA warnings they couldn't hear, and an elderly man with Parkinson's whose unkempt garden violated HOA standards. The FBI's Civil Rights Division was called in, and the investigation quickly expanded. Vista Properties had infiltrated 47 HOA boards across 23 states, targeting vulnerable populations with surgical precision. The company had created a shadow network of shell companies to hide their true ownership of HOA board seats, and they had installed over 200 board members like Margaret, each following the same playbook. But Vista Properties had made one crucial mistake. They underestimated Lucas's navigation app. Every time a user logged a harassment incident or safety concern, the app's AI system added it to a growing database of discriminatory patterns. This data, combined with the evidence from Margaret's phone, provided the FBI with everything they needed to dismantle the entire operation. As the investigation deepened, more victims came forward. A blind couple in Florida who had been forced out of their home of 30 years. An elderly Vietnamese community in California displaced by suddenly enforced English-only policies. A group of disabled veterans in Texas harassed until they sold their homes at a loss. The corruption reached higher than anyone had imagined. State housing commissioners had been bribed to ignore complaints. Building inspectors were paid to find violations in targeted homes. Even some disability advocacy organizations had been infiltrated by Vista's agents, who discouraged legal action and pushed for private settlements. 3 months after the attack on Lucas, Oakwood Heights had become a model for inclusive community design. The wind chimes were back, now protected by federal law as a reasonable accommodation. The textured sidewalk markers had been expanded throughout the neighborhood, and the community center, where Margaret had once tried to stop Lucas from teaching piano, had been renamed the Lucas Carter Center for Inclusive Community. Lucas's navigation app was now being implemented nationwide as a standard tool for documenting HOA discrimination. The Department of Justice had established it as part of their new civil rights monitoring system. Last week, Lucas demonstrated the app to a congressional committee, earning a standing ovation for his vision of a future where discrimination was impossible to hide. But perhaps the most meaningful change happened right there in Oakwood Heights. The neighbors, once divided by fear and prejudice, had come together to protect their most vulnerable members. Mrs. Nguyen's wind chimes rang out across the neighborhood, not just as navigation aids, but as symbols of their victory. Mr. Harris's security cameras still kept watch, no longer out of fear, but as guardians of the inclusive community they had built. As Daniel stood at the back of the community center, watching Lucas teach piano to a diverse group of students, he felt a sense of pride he hadn't known since Emily's passing. The new family across the street, whose daughter used a wheelchair, had just attended their first HOA meeting. When they walked in, looking nervous, Lucas stepped up to the microphone. "Welcome home," he said, his voice strong and clear. "You're safe here. We make sure of it." The room erupted in applause, every neighbor standing to welcome them. Because that's what real communities do. They embrace, protect, and celebrate every member. In the end, Margaret Blackwell didn't just fail to drive them out. She helped them discover who they truly were. The only real nuisance in any neighborhood is the prejudice that tries to divide us. And the strongest communities are those where everyone belongs. The fallout from the exposure of Vista Properties' scheme sent shockwaves across the nation. News outlets picked up the story, and soon, Oakwood Heights became a symbol of resistance against systemic discrimination. Lucas's navigation app, now rebranded as Community Guardian, was downloaded by thousands of users across the country. Every incident of harassment, every discriminatory HOA policy, and every act of intimidation was documented and uploaded to the app's growing database. The app's AI system, enhanced by Mr. Harris's security expertise began identifying patterns of abuse that even the FBI hadn't yet uncovered. In Washington, D.C., lawmakers took notice. The Community Protection Act, inspired by the events in Oakwood Heights, was fast-tracked through Congress. The act mandated stricter oversight of HOA boards, required transparency in their decision-making processes, and established federal protections for disabled, elderly, and minority homeowners. It also allocated funds for the installation of safety features, like textured sidewalks and accessible ramps, in neighborhoods across the country. But the fight was far from over. As the FBI's investigation expanded, they discovered that Vista Properties was just one arm of a much larger organization, the Community Preservation Alliance, CPA. This shadowy group, masquerading as a charitable organization, had been lobbying for stricter HOA powers while secretly coordinating discriminatory campaigns nationwide. Their ultimate goal was to reshape America's suburbs into what they called demographically optimized communities, places where only the right kind of people were welcome. The FBI's cybercrime unit, working with Lucas and Mr. Harris, uncovered a treasure trove of evidence on the CPA's servers. Internal communications revealed plans to target 20 more communities, each with significant disabled, elderly, or minority populations. The CPA had even begun experimenting with new tactics, such as using AI to identify undesirable residents based on social media activity and public records. But the most damning evidence came from a hidden folder on Margaret Blackwell's laptop. It contained a video of a private CPA meeting where the CEO, Victor Langston, openly discussed their strategy. "Once we establish the legal precedent," Langston said, "we can expand our demographic optimization to any community in America. The suburbs are the last frontier, and we will reshape them in our image." The video was leaked to the press, sparking nationwide outrage. Protests erupted in cities across the country, with people demanding justice for the victims of HOA discrimination. The CPA's political allies, once untouchable, found themselves under investigation. Several state housing commissioners resigned in disgrace, and a prominent senator was indicted for accepting bribes from Vista Properties. Margaret Blackwell and 23 other HOA board members faced federal charges for civil rights violations and racketeering. The trial, held in a packed courtroom, was a media sensation. Lucas, now 17, took the stand as the prosecution's star witness. His testimony, delivered with quiet dignity, moved the jury to tears. "Do you know what it's like to be told you don't belong in your own home?" Lucas asked, his voice steady. "To be told that your very existence is a nuisance? That's what Margaret Blackwell and her allies did to me and so many others. But we fought back. And we won." The evidence against the defendants was overwhelming. The security footage of the attack on Lucas, the emails detailing the CPA's strategy, and the testimony of dozens of victims left no room for doubt. After a 6-week trial, the jury returned a unanimous verdict, guilty on all counts. Margaret Blackwell was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Victor Langston received a life sentence, and the CPA was officially dissolved. Vista Properties' assets were seized, and the courts directed the funds toward a victims' compensation fund, helping displaced families repurchase their homes at pre-fraud prices. Back in Oakwood Heights, the community continued to heal. The Lucas Carter Center for Inclusive Community became a hub of activity, hosting daily classes for students of all abilities. Lucas's piano lessons were more popular than ever, and he began mentoring other disabled teens who wanted to develop their own apps and tools. The neighborhood itself had transformed. The textured sidewalk markers, once removed by Margaret's orders, now extended throughout the community. Mrs. Nguyen's wind chimes, protected by federal law, rang out across the streets, their melodies a reminder of the community's resilience. Mr. Harris's security cameras, now equipped with advanced AI, monitored the neighborhood not out of fear, but as guardians of the inclusive community they had built. But the most profound change was in the people. Neighbors who had once turned a blind eye to Margaret's tactics now looked out for one another. The Patel family, whose autistic son had been targeted by the HOA, hosted community gatherings in their backyard. Mrs. Rodriguez, who used a wheelchair, was elected to the new HOA board, ensuring that no one would ever face the discrimination she had endured. A year after the trial, Lucas stood on the stage of the National Civil Rights Museum, accepting an award for his work on the Community Guardian app. The audience, filled with activists, lawmakers, and survivors of discrimination, rose to their feet in a standing ovation. "This award isn't just for me," Lucas said, his voice strong and clear. "It's for everyone who stood up against injustice. For every family who refused to be driven out of their homes. For every community that came together to protect its most vulnerable members. We proved that when we stand together, no one can divide us." As Lucas stepped off the stage, he was greeted by Daniel, Mrs. Gwen, Mr. Harris, and the rest of the Oakwood Heights community. They had traveled to the ceremony together, a testament to the bonds they had forged in the fight for justice. Back in Oakwood Heights, life had returned to a new normal. The neighborhood was thriving, its diversity celebrated rather than suppressed. The Community Guardian app continued to grow, with millions of users documenting incidents of discrimination and sharing stories of resilience. One evening, as the sun set over the tree-lined streets, Daniel and Lucas sat on their porch, listening to the sound of Mrs. Gwen's wind chimes. A new family had just moved in across the street, their daughter using a wheelchair. At their first HOA meeting, Lucas had welcomed them with the same words he had spoken a year earlier. "You're safe here. We make sure of it." As Daniel looked out at the neighborhood, he felt a sense of pride and hope. The fight against discrimination was far from over, but Oakwood Heights had shown what was possible when a community came together. They had turned a story of pain and prejudice into one of resilience and unity. And as the wind chimes rang out, their melodies carried a promise. In Oakwood Heights, and in communities across the country, everyone belonged. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.